Okay, so here we are, second lesson, okay, where I'm off. And what I want to do is continue from yesterday, so yesterday we were talking about homeostasis in the nervous system, about how we can react to a stimulus to either maintain a constant internal environment, or just, if it's a coordinated response, react just to a change in the environment and bring about the response that we want to bring about. Before I start the lesson, which is going to be all about the structure and the function of the different parts of the nervous system, with specifically the 3 types of nerve cells that are involved, I just want you to have a watch of this little video. So if the cover supervisor could pause the lesson, please, and just show this video. There is a link on the Google Classroom, and hopefully it's been emailed to you as well. And then once you've watched it, have a little discussion about what's actually happened to Christopher Reeve. I'm hoping that some 11Y2 might actually recognise who he is, that you're not too young to know who he is or was. And then have a little think about why he can't move his arms and his legs. Okay, so if you could pause that, watch that now, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, so title lesson, structure and function of the nervous system. So what we want to do is talk about how the structure of the nervous system is adapted to its function. Okay, so how those different nerve cells carry out their function to the best of their ability. Maybe that's not the right way to say it, but how they're adapted to their function anyway, of transmitting a nervous impulse. First of all, I want to just recap, okay, the parts of the nervous response that we did yesterday. Then we're going to talk about the structure of the different nerve cells. And then, okay, if I had been with you and we weren't living in a COVID world, we would have done this investigation with regard to reaction times, just to introduce how we can do it. Obviously, okay, we can't, but I will show you through this PowerPoint what we could have done. And there's a little simulation that the cover supervisor might be able to show you. But that will bring us on to when we do the required practical, which we will be able to do, where we investigate reaction times with regard to catching a ruler. Okay, so recapping from yesterday. So these were the different parts of a nervous response. So have a little look at these, have a little think about it. Okay. Right, so a stimulus, okay, I'm hoping, okay, when you're looking at the board, you were thinking that the stimulus is the change in the environment. The receptor is then the part of the body that detects that change. And remember, we had those in all the different sense organs. So whether it was chemoreceptors in your nose to detect smell, or thermoreceptors in your skin to detect temperature, or pain receptors in your skin, all these different receptors in the different sense organs allow us to detect the change in the environment. Once we've detected that change, okay, we send a signal to the coordination center, or the central nervous system, which is the part of the body that interprets the information and coordinates a response. And that is either the brain or the spinal cord, depending on whether it's a conscious or an unconscious thought or response process. The central nervous system, or coordination center, then sends a message to the effector, which is the muscle of the gland, and the part of the body that responds to that change, which will then bring about a response, which is the result, or what we do to respond to that change in the environment. So 2 main parts of the nervous system. I introduced these in yesterday's lesson. So we have got the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and we've got the peripheral nervous system, okay, where we've got these neurons that are bundled into nerves. So these are your sensory and your motor neurons, which we're going to come on to in a little bit. Okay, and both of these come together to make quick short-term reactions to the environment and coordinate behaviour, or coordinate our responses to a change in the environment. Right, so we saw this slide yesterday, which was showing on the left-hand side here, okay, the summary of the different parts of a nervous response, to then showing you a conscious response and one without without thought. Okay, so this is your reflex, this is your conscious thought that you're aware of doing. And remember, okay, the main difference between whether it is a conscious process or without conscious thought is whether it goes via the brain or the spinal cord. remember I did say yesterday there are some instances where reflexes, which is what this one does, do go through the brain, and that's if the brain is going to be a closer part of the nervous system than the spinal cord would be in terms of the rapidness of a reflex response. So remember, these responses are very fast, they are automatic, they occur to protect ourselves against danger, whereas these ones, okay, are form the vast majority of responses that we do, where we are aware of doing them. They go via our brain, we think about how we are going to coordinate that response, and then we do it. That thought process obviously is very fast, so although I say you are thinking about it, sometimes it's happening very quickly, so you are sort of unaware that it's happening. But all the same, okay, you are still aware of it, so it is a slower response than these reflex responses. Right, if we could pause the video again and show this video, which again will be on the Google Classroom and on being emailed to the cover supervisor, and just have a little think about what the stimulus is, what the receptors are that are being used, what are the effectors, and what's the response when we've got these babies here, toddlers, okay, that are dancing. Right. Okay, so that has recapped, okay, the different parts of a nervous response that we did yesterday. So now I want to move on and specifically talk about the structure and function of the sensory motor, and I'm going to bring in these other ones called relay neurons. Okay, so we're now talking about this part of the response. So we're talking about the motor neuron and the sensory neurons here forming part of the peripheral nervous system, as is shown here, and the brain and the spinal cord making up the central nervous system, which are made of neurons called relay neurons. Right, so neurons, okay, specialized cells that conduct electrical impulses through the body. Okay, so they carry an electrical impulse. That is often an important, like, couple of keywords to write in exam answers. So a nerve, so the neuron is the cell. A nerve is then a bundle of nerve fibers within this protective sheath, because nerve fibers are long axons of neurons together with any associated tissues. So we've got nerves, bundles of nerve fibers. Neurons are the actual specialized cells. So the neurons, are we talking about the sensory neurons, the motor neurons, or the relay neurons? Right, if we're talking about general neuron structure, I'm going to use this one as an example, okay? And I would quite like you to, on the next slide, I think that's on the next slide, there we go. I'd like you to draw and label the diagram. So if I just flick, actually I can't flick back now, I'll have to do it from animation. So this is our general nerve structure, okay? And then I'm going to go on to talk about the three specific types of nerve cell or neurons. So any of these nerve cells have got a nucleus. The nucleus, okay, is then surrounded by the cell body, which is this part here. And at the end of the cell body, you've got these little projections here, which are the dendrites. Now, this means that at the end of any one of these little dendrites, they could be connected to another nerve cell. So the end of one of these could be in contact with the end of one of these on another nerve cell, with that gap, that synapse in between that we'll come onto into the next lesson. So it's like nucleus in the cell body. At the end of the cell body, we've got these dendrites, which are the projections that will contact other nerve cells. And because there's so many of them, it means they can be potentially in contact with lots and lots of different nerve cells. You've then got, I'm going to do this one first, okay, the axon, which is a very long, thin, part of the nerve cell, which is surrounded by the myelin sheath. Now the myelin sheath specifically, okay, the electrical impulse will travel along the axon. Okay, so if these dendrites were picking up an electrical impulse, it'd be passed down, okay, down through here and down through the axon to the nerve endings, when it would then be passed on to another nerve cell, the dendrites of another nerve cell. So the axon is very long and thin, so that it can conduct the impulse very quickly because it's very, very long and thin. It's then surrounded by this thing called the myelin sheath. Now, the myelin sheath is a fatty layer. It acts as an insulator. Now, it's very important to remember that it is an insulator and not a protective layer. This is when a lot of students go wrong. They talk about the myelin sheath protecting the axon. It doesn't protect it, it insulates it. Because what you don't want to do is lose any of that electrical impulse en route. So the myelin sheath insulates the axon to ensure that as much of that electrical impulse passes down the axon to the nerve endings as possible. Okay, so it is an insulator, fatty layer that acts as an insulator. Right, so once you've drawn that diagram, I'd like you to add these adaptations. Okay, so which ones are the thin projections connecting with other neurons to pass the electrical impulse down the neuron? Which part of it is a long, thin structure that propagates the impulse down the neuron? And which one is a lipid or a fat layer that insulates the axon, reducing the loss of the impulse? Okay, these are important adaptations for this general nerve cell structure. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video, let you draw that out, and then I want you to add these adaptations in now. Okay, so hopefully you've all got the idea that it's the dendrites, okay, that are the thin projections connecting with other neurons to pass the electrical impulse down the neuron. It's the axon, that's the long, thin structure that propagates the impulse down the neuron. And it's the myelin sheath, that's the lipid layer that insulates the axon, reducing the loss of the impulse. Remember, this is our general nerve cell structure. So if we then look specifically at the three different types of neurons, we have got sensory neurons, we've got motor neurons, and we've got relay neurons. So remember, your sensory neurons are the ones that connect the receptor to the coordination center. So it could be that when you've detected your change in your environment with your receptors, they will send a signal to the coordination center, whether it's the brain or the spinal cord, via a sensory neuron. You've then got your motor neurons, which will then connect between your your coordination center and the effectors. So this would either be a muscle or a gland. In this case here, it's a muscle. It might be a gland as well. So they are the ones that take the impulse away from the coordination center to the effector to bring about the response. And then you have this third type of neuron, okay, which is the relay neuron. So these are the ones that bridge the gap between the sensory and the motor ones. So they are the ones that make up your central nervous system. So you have lots and lots of relay neurons in your brain and lots of ones in your spinal cord. So these relay neurons make up your central nervous system. Your sensory and your motor ones make up your peripheral nervous system. Right, so now, again, I want you to pause and draw a little diagram of a sensory neuron, because you may get in an exam question a diagram, it might be a multiple choice question, and you have to name what type of nerve cell it is. So you have to be able to recognise what the different nerve cells look like. So a sensory neuron is a little bit different from the general nerve structure in that the cell body, okay, if I put all these labels on, the cell body is in the middle of the axon. So at one end of it, you've got dendrites, which will connect to your receptors. I say whether it's your thermoreceptors, your chemoreceptors. They will pick up the impulse, send it down the axon, which is in the middle, the long, thin structure again. But as I say, this time, the cell body with the nucleus is in the middle of the axon, with the myelin sheath going round it again. The signal's going this way down the axon. It will then go to other dendrites at the other end of the sensory neuron, which will then connect with your relay neurons in your central nervous system. So if we pause the video, do a little drawing of that so we can recognise what a sensory neuron looks like. It doesn't have to be beautiful as long as you could be able to recognise that. Right. Okay, so next one is the motor neuron. Remember, it's your sensory neurons and your motor neurons that make up this peripheral nervous system. So these are the nerve cells that are taking that impulse from the coordination center, from the brain or the spinal cord, down to the effector. So this is what our classic nerve cell would look like. Okay, so when you're looking at that classic nerve cell, that general nerve cell structure, more often than not, it is a motor neuron that you are looking at. So here again, okay, we've got a cell body at the end. You've got the dendrites, which are going to connect to all those relay neurons in the central nervous system. You've then got your axon, your myelin sheath, which will take the impulse rapidly down that axon. Okay, remember the myelin sheath insulating it, down to the nerve endings, which will connect to a muscle or a gland. to then bring about the response. So if we pause the video, please, and just draw a little diagram of what a motor neuron looks like. So again, you could recognize it if it was a diagram, an image, and an exam question. The relay neurons, you don't really have to know what they look like. It's more the fact, as long as you've got the idea that the relay neurons make up your central nervous system. So they're the ones that are present in the brain and the spinal cord. Right, so now, okay, I hope you all recognise that this is Stephen Hawking, okay, so he died of a disease called motor neuron disease. So I've put the text here, it says this is degenerative, as in it gets worse over time disease that stops the motor neurons working properly. Okay, this is what he died of. So I've put the question here, but suggest the reason that he was able to be a leading theoretical physicist at the same time as being unable to speak or move on his own. So have a little think about what happens if his motor neurons are affected, but not the other ones. Okay, why would this be the case? He eventually died because of the fact that the motor neurons would have been the ones that are responsible for things like his heartbeat, his breathing, because the effectors in that case are things like your heart, your lungs. And if they stop functioning completely, then obviously, he was no longer able to survive. Right, so that has, as I say, described, okay, those two, the main parts of the peripheral nervous system, the sensory and the motor neurons, and I've introduced the idea of the relay neurons, which are making up the central nervous system. Right, last part then, with regard to investigating reaction times. Had I been here, as I say, we may have been able to do something, but hopefully the cover supervisor might be able to show you something in a moment. Right, so I put reactions are coordinated responses. So when we talk about reaction times, we're usually talking about a conscious response rather than one that's a reflex without conscious thought. So we're talking about one where we're aware of it happening. So when we do the ruler test, when we drop a ruler and catch it, your eyes will detect it and will bring about all of those responses to end up in the muscles in your arms, on your hand, I suppose, to move your arm and your hand to coordinate catching that response. So it's a conscious thought process. This is something I say that we would have been able to do if it wasn't for COVID, but just imagine doing it in the class, okay, whereby, okay, we were all holding hands, okay, big circle, we're all holding hands, but we close our eyes. And you do that, not Mexican wave thing, but whereby it says close your eyes and time how quickly you can pass a squeeze around the circle. So literally, one person squeezes your hand. As soon as one hand has been squeezed, you then squeeze the person on the other side of your hand with squeezing it, and you pass this squeeze around a circle. Obviously, if you've got your eyes closed, that reduces one of your senses. So you are purely waiting for the touch sense, or the thermoreceptors in your hands and your skin, to detect that stimulus and then pass it on to bring about the response, which is squeezing your other hand to the next person. How could we reduce the time it takes for the message to get around the circle? Well, if you think about it, if we open our eyes, then we would be able to do it faster, because we would have not only the touch, the thermoreceptors detecting the change, but we'd also have our photoreceptors in our eyes detecting that change. So we could see how fast our reaction speeds would bring about this passing this squeeze around the circle. The other thing that we could do, which I'm hoping, is say I will put this link on the Google Classroom, and hopefully the cover supervisor will be able to just demonstrate this to you, even if we wouldn't be able to do it as a class. If it's on the Google Classroom, you might be able to have a go at doing it at home. But there's a nice little activity whereby you shoot sheep basically with a little dart, and it is testing your reactions time. So how fast you notice something happening with your eyes and your photoreceptors to then pressing the button on the computer. Okay, it's computer simulation to be able to test your reaction speeds. And as I say, we will do this practically when we do our ruler one, when we got with regards to dropping a ruler and seeing how fast we can catch it when we do the required practical when I'm back in. I will not worry about those. Right, so just to end, I want to do a little quiz. So if you write 1 to 5 in your books, and I will ask 5 questions. So I'm just waiting for you to write 1 to 5. Okay, so question 1. Okay, what's the difference between a neuron and a nerve? Okay, for some reason I've got two number ones. Okay, never mind. What are the two types of effector? Right, number 3. Okay, what's a receptor? Number 4, what does a sensory neuron do? And number 5, what does a motor neuron do? Okay, so going through the answers, if need be, if the cover supervisor could pause to give you time to do it, or if not, we'll just go straight on to the answers. So number 1, what's the difference between a neuron and a nerve? So remember, okay, neurons are individual cells, but nerves are bundles of neurons. What are the two types of effectors? So we should have got muscles and glands. What is a receptor? Receptor are the cells that detect the stimulus. What does a sensory neuron do? It transmits the signal from the receptor to the central nervous system or the coordination centre. And what does a motor neuron do? It transmits the signal from the coordination centre or the central nervous system to the effector. Okay, so hopefully now you've got some idea of the different types of nerve cells in the nervous system, the motor, the relay and the sensory neurons, and what they do, and how we can investigate reaction times. Little introduction, as I say, we will do this again properly when I come back to school. Right, thank you for this. There'll be one more lesson which will be all about reflexes for Monday, which is all about those uncoordinated responses, or not uncoordinated, but ones that don't use conscious thought, so they happen very rapidly. Okay, I think you should have some exam questions to do. The mark scheme should be at the back. Don't cheat. Have a go at the exam questions, and then use the mark scheme at the back to assess your responses. And remember to always add in, if you miss mark points, remember to add in what those right answers should have been for your revision and to try and learn, okay, those mark points. Okay then, right, bye bye for now.